Hello, students. Let's start, okay? Everyone here? Welcome to the History of 2021 in Canada seminar. How's everybody doing today? Okay, not too bad. All right, I see that we have a few students in class, and I think there's one person online, so that's great. Today's topic is the arts and the ecological crisis in 2021. Et comme vous le savez, le cours d'histoire de 2021 au Canada est une classe bilingue, alors sentez-vous tout à fait à l'aise de parler dans la langue de votre choix. So, as I said, please feel free to speak in the language of your choice and also in the writing assignments. So, today we're going to do a case study of the second season of the Conscient podcast, which ran from March to August 2021. It was produced by an Ottawa-based sound artist, Claude Schryer, who has passed away now. But I was very fortunate that his children, Riel and Clara, kindly helped me do some of the research for this class. So I want to thank them. And I want to check and see if you've all had a chance to listen to the course materials, which were Conscient Podcast Episodes 19, Reality, and 62 Compilation. Were you able to...
Excuse me.
Yeah, sure.
Can you tell me why you chose this podcast specifically? I mean, there must have been a lot of different podcasts in Canada covering topics of art and environment. So why this one specifically?
Well, that's a very good question. I chose the second season of this podcast because Schryer was exploring the themes of reality and ecological grief. That seemed really timely in 2021, and still is today. The podcast gave us a snapshot of what artists and cultural workers were thinking in relation to the ecological crisis. So it was an interesting year, 2021, in that way. It was the year, actually, when the 6th IPCC report was released. There were fires all across Western Canada, which unfortunately became the norm across Canada. It's also when SCALE, the Sectoral Climate Arts Leadership for the Emergency Organization, started up their work, and a whole bunch of other things that were really important and pivotal. So I think I'll start the class with Schryer himself explaining what Season 2 was in his own words. And this is an excerpt from a conversation with theater artist Ian Garrett from episode 54.
Why did I ask that question? Well, the reason is because I was living it myself. I was feeling that accepting reality was necessary for me to move on into a more active, engaged. I had to kind of deal with that. The fact that it's so bad that if I don't actually accept that it's especially the baked in things that we can't change, I can't function. And just today, today is May 25th. I had a really bad, dark day. I was, crying inside my head about how bad things are and just losing hope. And then I read this beautiful piece by Rebecca Solnit, who was saying, there's some hope out there because the combination of all these efforts, you have been doing a lot, but when you combine that with so many, like millions and millions of people around the world who are making a difference, it will come together and there will be a tipping point towards some kind of not just awakening, but action, collective action. That's where we need to go, and that's where we are going.
OK, mais ce balado a été produit par un homme blanc, avec tous les préjugés de l'époque?
That's a good point. Schryer had, good intentions, but did carry some unconscious biases in his discourse that were typical of his generation and his times. What we're doing today is focusing on his guests, who I think were really interesting, and they come from a wide range of cultural backgrounds, ages, and points of view. Oh, that's your phone. Why don't we start with one of my favorite quotes, and it's from episode 55. And luckily for me, I was able to listen to all of them as part of the research for this class. So it's from Indigenous artist France Trépanier, who was a visual artist, curator, and researcher of Gyannahaga and French ancestry. And Trépanier was known, amongst other things, for her work on a project called Primary Colors, which placed Indigenous arts at the center of the Canadian art system. So this excerpt is in French, so I'll let you listen to the original recording, then I'll explain what France was talking about for those who don't understand French. And of course, you can use the simultaneous translation function on your computers as well.
Je pense que ce cycle-là du colonialisme et de ce que ça a apporté, je pense qu'on est en train d'arriver à la fin de ce cycle-là aussi. Et avec le recul, on va s'apercevoir, je pense, que ça a été un tout petit instant dans un espace beaucoup plus vaste. Et on est en train de retourner à des connaissances très profondes de qu'est-ce que ça veut dire de vivre ici, sur cette planète, ce que ça implique comme possibilité, mais comme responsabilité aussi, et de maintenir les relations harmonieuses. Moi, je dis la solution à la crise climatique, c'est cardiaque. Ça va passer par le cœur. C'est de retomber en amour avec la planète. Tu sais, c'est ça le travail.
What Trépanier is saying here is that she thinks that the 500 plus year cycle of colonialism on Turtle Island was coming to an end. And we now know that she was right, with the indigenization of Canadian culture movement that started right around then. People began to understand what the true meaning of reconciliation was during this era. And this quote by Trépanier, she talks about how it's everyone's responsibility to maintain harmonious relationships in their communities and also our need to love the planet. Does anyone have any questions so far? No, so then I'll move.
But how did the indigenization of Canadian culture happen?
Oh, can I answer that one?
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
So throughout the early history of Canada, the arts and culture scene was dominated by European art forms. And so, there was no space for Indigenous voices. It was part of the colonial structure. But it changed when people started listening to Indigenous voices and learning about Indigenous culture and languages at school, like I did. And it led to a massive change in cultural institutions and a shift in people's worldview.
Well, that's exactly right. Thank you for that. Let me give you another example of an Indigenous artist from season 2. Now, Suzanne Keeptu was a Métis writer and teacher who wrote a book in 2021 called We All Go Back to the Land, the Who, Why, and How of Land Acknowledgements. This is an excerpt from episode 47.
So in the work that I do, or the book that I've just had published called We All Go Back to the Land, it's really an exploration of that original agreement and what it means today. So I want to remind Indigenous readers of our original agreement to nurture and protect and honor and respect the Earth Mother and all of the gifts that she has for us, and then to introduce that original agreement to non-Indigenous Canadians or others of the world, so that we can together as a human species work toward what I call the ultimate act of reconciliation to help heal the earth.
We'll come back to more Indigenous perspectives at the end of today's class. The next recording that I want you to listen to, can everybody hear them well? The sound level's okay? Yeah. Is from episode 21. It's philosopher Dr. Todd Dufresne, who wrote a book in 2020 called The Democracy of Suffering.
I think capitalism is over. But the problem is we have nothing to replace it with. And here's when we need our artists and others to tell us what kind of vision they have for a future that is different than that. Well, a future of play and work, meaningful work, would be one future that I think is not just utopic, but very possible. So there's a possible future moving forward that could be much better than it is right now, but we're not going to get there without the democracy of suffering as we're experiencing it now, and will at least over the next 20, 30, 40 years until we figure this out. But we need to figure it out quickly.
Well, overall, Dr. Dufresne was right. We did go through a lot of physical and mental anguish, didn't we? And we still are, in fact, with the resettlements, the food rations, and all of that. But we did survive. And it's interesting to see that Dufresne was right in predicting that artists would help articulate a vision for the future. Now, artists have always done this, right? But it was particularly important at this time when the window of time before irreparable damage was narrowing. There was a sense at the time that there was only a few years left, and they were right. So we'll come to see how this happened a bit later, but let's move on to see some of the causes of the ecological crisis. Why did this happen, and what were some of the underlying conditions? So here's an excerpt from episode 23 that features environmental activist Anjali Appadurai and provides insights on a range of social and ecological justice issues. By the way, does anybody know why Appadurai is famous in the history of climate activism?
Wasn't she the one who gave the speech in South Africa in the early 2000s? I saw it on YouTube the other day in my history social equity class. I actually think I can play it from my laptop. Yeah, here it is.
I speak for more than half the world's population. We are the silent majority. You've given us a seat in this hall, but our interests are not on the table. What does it take to get a stake in this game? Lobbyists, corporate influence, money? You've been negotiating all my life. In that time, you've failed to meet pledges. You've missed targets and you've broken promises.
Thanks, that's right. I suggest you check out the entire speech when you get a chance. Now, let's listen to Anjali in her conversation with Schryer. This excerpt is quite fun because they're doing a sound walk in a park in Vancouver, and you can hear some of the soundscapes from the time, like crows and those loud gas-powered vehicles during the conversation that were typical of this rather noisy era anyway. It all sounds so much different today, doesn't it? Here's an excerpt of their conversation.
The climate crisis and the broader ecological crisis is, to me, a symptom of the deeper disease. And the deeper disease, which is that rift from nature, that seed of domination and of accumulation and of greed and of the urge to dominate others through colonialism, through slavery, through othering. The root is actually othering. That is something that artists can touch, and that's what has to be healed. And when we heal that, what could come of it? What does the world on the other side of that look like? And in simpler terms, it's what does the world on the other side of a just transition look like? And I'd really like to believe it doesn't look like exactly this, but with solar. The first language that colonization sought to suppress, which was that of Indigenous peoples, is where a lot of the answers are held.
So Appadurai worked closely with fellow activist Seth Klein on a project called the Climate Emergency Unit, which made a parallel between Canada's efforts during World War II and the efforts required to achieve the just transition and avoid the worst outcomes of climate change as such. And they referred to a book by Seth Klein called A Good War.
Can you tell us more about the Climate Emergency Unit? What happened to them?
Well, I know that they were funded by the David Suzuki Institute, and they had 4 goals. Let me see if I can remember them. Oh, wait a second. I think I have them right here. Okay, here they are. To spend what it takes to win, to create new economic institutions to get the job done, to shift from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures, and to tell the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicate a sense of urgency about the measures necessary to combat it. The unit was dissolved once they achieved those goals, or at least they were sufficiently advanced to be able to move on to other things.
That's amazing.
Well, yes, it was amazing, but it was an uphill battle, and we are thankful that they persisted, along with thousands of other similar environmental initiatives around the world at that time. And most importantly, once they were combined, those efforts really made a difference. People worked together as a community, and they were able to push us away, us and all living beings, from the precipice of catastrophe and towards the recovery that we're experiencing today. At least we're able to continue life on the planet. And yeah, the crisis goes on, but back in 2021, they didn't know whether they would succeed, and this must have been hard for them. There was great uncertainty, like at the beginning of World War II in 1940, when Canada and its allies did not know whether their efforts to fight fascism in Europe would succeed. So let's listen to Seth Klein, leader of the Climate Emergency Unit, from episode 26, and his interest in the arts as a way to help rally people to the cause.
Here would be my challenge to artists today, and maybe to you too, Claude. So we're beginning to see artists across many artistic domains producing climate and climate emergency art, which is important and good to see. What's striking to me is most of it, in the main, is dystopian. about how horrific the world will be if we fail to rise to this moment. And to a certain extent, that makes sense, right? Because it is scary and horrific. But here's what intrigued me about the artists, what artists were producing in the war, is that in the main, it was not dystopian, even though the war was horrific. It was rallying us. The tone was rallying us. It's similar, I found myself listening to this music as I was doing the research, and I was thinking, wow, okay, World War II had a popular soundtrack, and the anti-Vietnam War had a popular soundtrack. And when I was a kid in the peace and disarmament movement, there was a popular soundtrack. This doesn't have a popular soundtrack yet.
Yeah, but we have a popular soundtrack now for the climate emergency. I sometimes listen to them on my oldies playlist on Spotify. Do you know that tune from 2025? How did it go? It's the climate emergency.
Okay, but okay, something I'm having trouble understanding here. So they had the scientific data, they had the reports. What exactly was it that they were missing? What didn't they have? Why didn't they act? Why were they why were they so stagnant in their attempts to fight this problem?
Well, that's a good question. Let's look at the social structure at the time. The oil and gas industry were extremely wealthy and powerful, and they were desperate to maintain their grip on power. And this, despite the cost to the environment and life on Earth as it may be. But, to be fair, people at the time were also complicit in this dynamic because they were users of this oil and gas. But also because Western society had built a massive infrastructure that essentially was based on non-renewable resources. And that was destroying the planet and essentially was a self-destructive path. How can we understand this? Well, Schryer talked to a lot of researchers and thought leaders who provided context and insights. Let's listen to an arts researcher called Dr. Danielle Boutet. This one's in French. She explains the lack of collective awareness. This comes from episode 60. So I'll give you a short summary afterwards.
En fait, collectivement, on est inconscient. On cherche à parler de la conscience écologique, on cherche à parler de ça, mais en réalité, s'il y a une psyché collective, ce que je pense qu'il y a une espèce d'esprit collectif, mais c'est un esprit qui est inconscient, qui n'est pas capable de se voir aller, de se réfléchir, et donc pas capable de méditer, pas capable de se transformer, donc soumis à ses peurs, puis à ses pulsions, puis tout ça. Fait que je suis assez pessimiste par rapport à ça, mais c'est que le deuil écologique, tout le chagrin, puis toute la peur est refoulé présentement. Il y a des activistes qui crient dans le désert, qui hurlent, puis les gens entendent, mais comme dans un brouillard, puis c'est pas suffisant pour emmener à une action collective. Donc, le deuil, il est loin d'être fait, à mon avis, collectivement.
So what Boutet is saying here is that people in 2021 were collectively unconscious or unaware of the severity of environmental issues. Boutet, who is a leading expert on contemporary art, but also on social issues, explains that people were not capable of changing their ways and that their grief and fears were being repressed. She admits that some activists were screaming out loud and that some people were listening, but it was all in the fog, which she calls brouillard in French. And there simply wasn't enough momentum to bring about collective action. Of course, thankfully, this would change once people finally woke up to the reality a few years later. At the time, it seemed quite grim. One of the issues at the time was also lack of agency. Let's listen to researcher and art strategist Alexis Fraz from episode 40. She's really quite articulate about this.
There is a lot of awareness and there's a lot of interest in making change, and yet change still isn't really happening at least not at the pace or scale that we need. And so it feels to me increasingly like there's not a lack of awareness or a lack of concern or even a lack of willingness, but actually a lack of agency. And so I've been thinking a lot about what is the role of arts and culture and creative practice in helping people not just wake up to the need for change, but actually undergo the entire transformational process from that moment of waking up, which I think, you and I share a language around Buddhist practice. And there's that, idea that you can wake up in an instant, but integrating the awakeness into your daily life is actually a process. It's an ongoing thing.
Okay, so I get that it's an ongoing thing, but what made the difference then? Do you really think that something as ephemeral and marginal as art had an impact?
Well, yes, actually it did. And we'll get to that soon. But first, I'd like to give you another example of the social dynamic of the time. Speaking of time, how are we doing for time? Everything okay? Yeah, I think we're still good. Here's an excerpt from episode 42 with architect Mark Rosen.
The idea of enough is very interesting to me. The idea that the planet doesn't have enough for us on our current trajectory is at the heart of that. But the question of whether the planet has enough for everyone on the planet if we change the way we do things is an interesting one. Can we sustain 7, 8, 9 billion people on the planet if everyone's idea of enough was balanced with that equation? I don't know, but I think it's possible. I think that if we've shown nothing else as a species, as humans, it's adaptability and resiliency. And when forced to, we can do surprisingly monumental things and changes when the threat becomes real to us.
Oh, okay, all right. I get it. Once the threat got real, they started getting self-interested and they started acting. But, okay, here's my question, though, right? Schryer starts talking about reality and grief as the two main topics in season 2, right? But why did he do that? Like, I know he's a Zen Buddhist and that they're interested in reality, but why those specific issues?
Oh, well, Schryer asked each of his 41 guests in season 2 how they viewed reality and ecological grief, and he got, as you can imagine, 41 different answers. Now, I've listened to them all, and I've found a few of them particularly compelling, and one of my favorites was Schreier's questions about ecological grief that were answered by a filmmaker named Jennifer Abbott, who was an activist filmmaker at the time and very well known. And
sorry, actually, I found some info about her. Let me see. Yeah, she co-directed and was the editor for The Corporation in 2003, and that became the most awarded documentary in Canadian history at the time. And then she did the New Corporation, The Unfortunate Necessary Sequel in 2020.
Oh, I have seen both those films. Yeah, film studies. Amazing documentaries. Oh, I bet they scared the living daylights.
And she was also director of The Magnitude of All Things from 2020, which is kind of a classic ecological grief film.
Yes, that's right. Let's listen to an excerpt from episode 45 where Abbott talks about delusion and brainwashing.
The notion of reality and the way we grasp reality as humans is so deeply subjective, but it's also socially constructed. And so, as a filmmaker, and this is relevant because I'm also a Zen Buddhist, from both those perspectives, I really try to explore what we perceive as reality, to untangle and figure out in what ways are we being deluded, and in what ways, do we have clear vision? And obviously, the more clear vision we can have, the better actions we take to ensure a more compassionate, just, and sustainable, livable world. So I'm all for sort of untangling the delusion, while admitting wholeheartedly that to untangle it fully is impossible.
Let's move on now to the other main issue in season 2, which is ecological grief, which at the time was defined as psychological response to loss caused by environmental destruction. The term solastalgia, coined by Australian Glenn Albrecht, was also used at the time. So what it basically means is that how one deals with the emotional charge of environmental loss. Of course, we're still dealing with ecological grief today, but at least we now know that one of the best ways to address loss is through regeneration and rebuilding. But back in 2021, ecological grief was just something that people were becoming aware of and weren't quite able to turn it into a positive force, at first anyway. Okay, why don't we look more in depth at grief for a moment? I'd like to start with musician Dr. Tanya Kalmanovich. Now, Kalmanovich is an interesting case because she was both an accomplished musician and a leading climate activist. She was actually raised in the heart of the oil sands in Alberta, and I think it was Fort McMurray.
Oh, I've heard some of her recordings. She was a great violist and improviser. Pretty cool lady.
Well, that's great that you heard the work. She was also a performer in a project called the Tara Sands Songbook. So that actually became a classic of the climate art canon in the years after that work was toured. So let's listen to her talk about grief and art in episode 53.
One of the larger crises we face right now is actually a crisis of failure of imagination. And one of the biggest things we can do in artistic practice is to nurture imagination. That's what we do. It's our job. We know how to do that. We know how to trade in uncertainty and complexity. We understand the content inside of silence. It's unlocking and speaking to ways of knowing and being and doing that when you start to try to talk about them in words is really challenging because it kind of ends up sounding like bumper stickers. Music builds bridges. And I have a big problem with like universalizing discourses in the arts, right? As being like a concealing structure of imperialism, colonialism.
So you can see that people were struggling with grief, including educators who were trying to figure out how to support their students, many of whom were demoralized and had given up hope. Now, all of you were students, so you might have experienced some of that yourselves. But it's around this time that tools started being created, such as the Creative Green Tools and the Existential Toolkit for Climate Justice Educators. And one of Schryer's interviews was with a climate educator named Dr. Krista Heiser. So let's listen to her from episode 51.
There's a whole range of emotions around climate emergency and not getting stuck in the grief, not getting stuck in anger. A lot of what we see of youth activism, they get kind of burned out in anger, I think. And it's not a sustainable emotion, but none of them are emotions that you want to get stuck in. When you get stuck in climate grief, it is hard to get unstuck. So moving through all the different emotions, including anger and including, hope and that idea of an anthem and working together. Those are all part of the emotion wheel that exists around climate change.
Okay, I understand about not getting stuck in climate grief, but now we're paying the price for their neglect. It makes me really angry to think that they could have easily prevented most of the current climate change damage during that critical decade in the 2020s. I don't know, by shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy? Professor, you say that artists play a key role in this, but how did this...
Thank you. I hear your anger, and I understand, and I promise we'll get to the role of artists in just a minute. But before that, I'd like you to hear Australian Michael Shaw, who produced a film in 2019 called Living in the Time of Dying. He talks about grief and fear, but also support structures in episode 25.
It's a real blessing to feel a sense of purpose in these times. It's a real blessing to be able to take the feelings of fear and grief, etc., and actually channel them somewhere into running a group or to making a film or, doing your podcasts. And I think it's important that people really tune in to find out what they're given to do at this time. To really listen to what the call is in you and follow it. I think there's something that's very generative and supportive about feeling a sense of purpose in a time of collapse.
So both Shaw and Schryer were influenced by Dharma teacher Catherine Ingram, who wrote an essay in 2020 called Facing Extinction. Here's Schryer reading an excerpt from Facing Extinction in episode 19.
Despite having caused so much destruction, it is important to consider the wide spectrum of possibilities that make up human life. Yes, on one end of that spectrum is greed, cruelty, and ignorance. On the other end is kindness, compassion, and wisdom. We are imbued with great creativity, brilliant communication, and extraordinary appreciation of and talent for music and other forms of art. There is no other known creature whose spectrum of consciousness is as wide and varied as our own.
Darn, another air pollution alarm. You guys know the drill. Go to a safe area until all is clear and the air is breathable again. I'm really sorry about this. What a unfortunate disruption to our class. We probably won't be able to come back, so why don't we call it a day and pick it up next week?
These damn things always go off right when things are getting good. I just really hope one doesn't go off next week.
Now let's get out of this small